So I know that on the topic of appropriations, we have a variety of diversity of folks on these calls. Some of you are very expert and well experienced in the process. Others may be wondering what this is all about. So I'm going to provide just a high-level overview of the process and then look forward to a conversation from there. So in thinking about the federal appropriations process, I think it's really about showing you the money, show me the money. And I put a couple photos here that I'm probably dating myself because this is from the movie, of course, Jerry Maguire, but I recognize there's probably a subset of folks on this call who may not know what that movie was. So this was a movie that came out, I think I was a senior or junior in high school. I think it was like 95, maybe 96, 97. So, more than 20, 23 years ago, but it had a famous line here, show me the money, where Tom Cruise, as a sports agent, was asked to prove his worth to a budding football player, and you had to basically repeat over and over again, show me the money. And that's essentially what federal appropriations is all about. It's showing everyone the money. It's the process by which Congress actually appropriates or allocates money to support a wide array of federal programs, departments, and agencies. Go into the next slide, and I'll just, at the front end, I'll throw in a few other caveats here. First and foremost is that the budget and appropriations process really doesn't work the way it's supposed to work on paper. It's one of those things, just like, there's the how a bill became a law that all of us who work in policy know is really often not exactly the way things happen. And I think it's very apt to say that things are very different, usually very different in appropriations. Actually, when you look at the past several decades, there's been very few years where Congress has done what it's supposed to do entirely and on time. And it gets to the point that when they actually do things on time in accordance with the schedules that are spelled out in various laws and directives, it actually makes news, such as a couple years back when they actually did a big spending bill, the bill that funds the Department of Health and Labor and Health and Human Services, Labor and Education, as well as the Defense Department. They actually did that before the fiscal year expired. And that was, again, quite newsworthy because it was such an anomaly for those of us who watch this and engage in this process year over year. And we have a lot of uncertainty as we look to the new year, the new Congress, some changes on the Appropriations Committee, and the overall question about what exactly this divided government will bring. So going forward, on the high level appropriations, it is interesting because this actually is spelled out in a very high level in the Constitution. So this means that Congress has the authority in Article 1 to spend your money. And the direct quote again, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So that really is the key here in terms of why Congress has to do this. And they have to do it every year to make the government continue to run. It's a lengthy process that is supposed to start with the president's budget request that goes to Congress, and that usually or is supposed to go out in early February, but often, as I noted, can arrive late. And this is essentially the president's recommendation as to what they would like to see Congress spend money on. But as you know, Congress has its own ideas, or several ideas, or 538 ideas about what they would like to spend their money on. And that's why a lot of times Congress will spend much time working on their own view. Sometimes this gets us a budget resolution, which lays out essentially a blueprint that will then be followed by the appropriations committees who actually put together individual spending bills. Right now, there are a dozen bills that fund all the governments, the departments, the agencies, and the programs. So these bills can cover either one department or agency, or they can cover several. And for the purposes of this discussion, I put here a few of the most important bills. The Labor, HHS, and Education bill is probably our most important bill for most of it, not everyone on this call. That funds the Department of Health, most of the Department of Health, the CDC, the NIH, and many other agencies and programs. Then you've got this Agriculture FDA bill, which funds the Food and Drug Administration. And then I know many of you also work with the Department of Defense and their peer review medical research program. So that's just a little summary. There's not one single bill technically. Oftentimes these can be packaged up in a single bill, but that's part of the complexity of this process because Congress does have to work on multiple bills. And this is just a little schematic again showing, like I spoke about a moment ago, how it's supposed to work. You're supposed to have, a nice little budget go from the White House to the Congress in early February, and then Congress will work up a budget resolution and do some additional hearings about the budget and offer their thoughts. And then sometime in the latter part of spring, early summer, the Appropriations Committee should pass their bills so that ideally these all get nice and neatly resolved and reconciled well in advance of the end of September when they can be signed into law and actually funding the government before the fiscal year prior expires. But again, this is the supposed to work slide, not how it actually works. So going on to our next slide, just a few other terms here that can be that are relevant to know as you think about appropriations. Authorization versus appropriation, or authorizing versus appropriation. So Congress can and does pass a lot of different legislation that creates policies or programs or requires agencies or departments to do certain things. But for most of those laws to actually work, particularly any law that creates a program, they need money. And that's where the appropriations process comes in, because most bills, some do, but not all, but most bills do not authorize and appropriate at the same time. So that means that every year Congress has to pass appropriations bills to actually fund what other Congress and what other congressional committees and what other laws have actually created. There's also a question, sometimes you hear people say, well, discretionary versus mandatory spending. So the appropriations bills cover only discretionary spending. That means the money that's not entitlement spending or that's not automatically required to be spent under various laws. So the mandatory category is actually the most significant part of federal spending. For mandatory, think about programs like Social Security checks, like Medicare benefits, like veterans benefits. Those get paid out regardless. Congress could do nothing. They still have to fund the operations. So I guess they do have to do something because you have to have people who actually run the programs. But they, on day in, day out, they could not touch those entitlement benefits, and they would still be paid out as they're supposed to do because they are mandatory programs. And again, about 60% of the federal budget, federal spending is in the mandatory or entitlement program. So less than half is what we focus on every year collectively. And then, you've probably heard the term, those of you who've been around for a while have heard of, are familiar with earmarks. Essentially, this is direct funding from Congress, where Congress writes into an appropriations bills that they want to see a certain amount of money go toward a certain program, project, sometimes even a direct recipient. They were very popular, about two decades ago. They've been limited over the past decade because of some abuses and some other challenges. There's a potential that they may come back. There's talk about them being resurrected. It's like the vampire that won't die. Every couple of years, Congress likes to think about bringing these back. They are popular for members, so it's something to keep an eye on as we head into the uncertainties of the new year. We'll go to the next slide. Again, this is just a little schematic showing that more than half, more than 60% of money tends to go to the mandatory policy, and that a relatively small chunk of that whole is on discretionary, but that's where we tend to focus our energies on. Go over to the next slide here, and then just a little bit of a deeper dive here. So the president's budget, so you might think, well, why are you budgeting and what's budget versus appropriations? Well, the budget is essentially the high level spending plan, often very heavily oriented by political ideology and budgetary views. So this is where the administration comes out and says, under our budget, we're going to do X, Y, and Z and all these great things. We're going to balance the budget in X number of years. We're going to cut the debt. We're going to make everyone happy, blah, blah, blah. This is their spending plan where they put out their marker and their priority. So it's not uncommon at times for the administration to be very politically wise in putting together their budget, because if they want to go for a certain message about reducing the deficit or being able to cut taxes, then they're going to have to do certain things to make that happen. So a lot of times the budgets tend to be, highly political in nature, and they also will often, and this is administrations of either party, will often cut or reduce funding for agencies and programs that they know are very popular and that Congress will ultimately restore funding for. So the budget is the starting point of the process. It's the administration's thinking and their view as to how they would like to see things operate. but it's by no means the end of the process. And going over to the next slide, the Congress again comes in. The Budget Committee is supposed to do a lot of work here. They'll hold hearings. Many of the appropriations committees and subcommittees will hold hearings where they'll bring various cabinet secretaries and agency heads and other folks to come together and talk about their budget, and they'll be grilled and pressed on all sorts of member questions and priorities. And when you have in some cases, in the best of cases, when things work somewhat right or as they are supposed to, Congress will actually put together a budget resolution, ideally one that's agreed to by both the House and Senate, that sets their parameters and their priorities, and that importantly sets a top line spending number, because that top line number will then be used by the appropriations committees, ideally, to put together their various spending bills. And a lot of the challenges that we have here these days are because we don't have agreement on even the top level spending numbers. This is something that's actually pending right now. One of the big questions around getting FY21 fully resolved is actually coming to an agreement here in late November on top level and then secondary spending levels. So it can be very challenging when you don't have a budget resolution to work off of, especially when you have, even more so when you have different balances of power in a chamber. We'll go over to the next slide here. And on this one, I think just really visually saying, if you think about budget versus appropriating, well, what's one mean? What's the other mean? I think of the budget as being something, if you're comparing it to your own household, you put together your high level of categories, your mortgage, your food, your entertainment, your education, whatever it may be. And then, that's the budget part. And then I think of appropriations a bit like that very granular list. Here's our grocery list. We need, 3 jars of sauce. We need 2 boxes of spaghetti. We need 4 things of water, whatever it may be, where you get to that line item level. Because while the appropriations bills fund the departments, they fund the agencies, they get down to the very programmatic level. You're talking, sub-$1 million marks here in many cases where they're actually putting that level of detail into the legislation or the corresponding report. So the appropriations would be the grocery list item here where you're getting into high level of detail. Go over to the next slide here. And again, just while we've talked a lot about how things often don't work out, here's how we often see things play out. So like we're talking about right now, here we are in late November, and we are still talking about FY21 bills, even though FY21 started in October. And at best, this won't be fully resolved until about another month or so from now. So when appropriations bills are completed late, that can often delay the issuance of the president's budget, particularly when these bills go into the new calendar year. Then it really can push the budget back. Like I mentioned, you often have a history here where Congress is not able to agree on a joint resolution. That then makes it really challenging because a lot of times the appropriations committees are playing with different numbers. So if you think about in a household, if one spouse had one set of numbers and another had another set of numbers, it probably doesn't work out very well if everyone's spending a different amount of money or has a different budget in mind for a project or for a shopping list. So that's essentially what happens here in Congress when they don't have agreement. You've got wide discrepancies between bills and chambers. A lot of times these bills are only debated in one chamber, or maybe they're not debated or advanced at all. And just, very quite apropos here, just last week, the Senate Appropriations Committee released all 12 of their FY21 spending bills, more than a month after the start of the fiscal year, but another indicator of how the process often doesn't work at all how it's envisioned. And then when you come around, late August or September, there's usually very little progress toward completing bills. So what you end up having here is like we've had under what we're under right now, is where Congress essentially passes a continuing resolution or a stopgap bill that funds the government to another point in time to prevent a government shutdown. And when agreements aren't reached, we have a total government shutdown or a partial government shutdown. And this unfortunately has become more common in recent years, with the most recent, I'll put quote partial shutdown because several departments and agencies were affected, was playing out, really just 2 years ago or less than 2 years ago, late 2018 into January of 2019, and it lasted for more than a month. So unfortunately, the wheels often do come off the car here, and we have more often than not some of these challenges playing out. We'll go down to the next slide just to bring everything in here to wrap it up. Sorry. So again, why bother? You might say, well, why am I going to even bother doing all this? Well, again, first and foremost, these bills are the only way to fund the government, and it's important for anyone who has an interest here to be engaged in the process. These bills are also often viewed as the only or one of the few, quote, must pass pieces of legislation. So it's an opportunity for you to engage on a bill that, you know, at some level, even if it's very late in the game and much later than what is supposed to happen, it will get done at some level during a year. So it's important to play for that reason. And then the other point here, I'll throw in another term here, again, something many of you who've been involved know well, but it's report language. This is the non-statutory or non-binding piece of appropriations bills, but that provides important directions from Congress to the various agencies and departments as to priorities and what they would like to see done. So this is a place where many in the patient advocacy world like to spend some time, because you can use that report language or guidance to grow and shape various programs and activities, particularly in areas like NIH and CDC. So it's something to take advantage of as part of your overall advocacy toolbox. And then just wrapping everything up on the next slide. Sorry, there we go. So what should you consider going? Again, first and foremost, with everything that's going on here, a lot of uncertainties, pay very close attention, including how Congress ultimately decides to move forward with appropriations, and both with the remainder of FY21 and how that gets resolved and what we'll see going forward. Looking for various members who may take on new roles. There's going to be a new chairman of the House Appropriations Committee in the new year, a new chairman of the Labor Aid Subcommittee. So a lot in flux here. Re-engage again, or consider engaging on the issues of importance to you. Consider also, I think importantly here, it's not just working with Congress, but ideally you're working with your agency stakeholders as well, so that Congress is doing things that could be pushed forward and that you're going to find some people at the agency that they're going to be receptive to doing. So that's another important piece of this here. You don't want to go out and only focus on appropriations with the Hill without talking to the agency. And then again, ultimately look at appropriations as one of many tools in the toolbox. It's not by any stretch the only thing you should go about doing, but it is something to consider utilizing, and as you play the overall game going forward, including looking at the long game. So I think wraps up my points. If there's any questions or comments, happy to take them, unless.
Great. No, that was very informative, Nick. I know that there was one question in the chat asking if you had advice on how to work to get report language included in an appropriations bill.
Sure. So appropriations report language, typically what you'll want to do is work with offices that you're already working with. So if you have a group of champions who are involved and engaged on your topic, start with them, start exploring with them, bring them the idea or ideas that you have. Here's what we need. This is what's happening at the agency, or this is where we could really use some support. Talk it over with them, and then ideally you'd want to think about putting together a provision or two. There's a lot of models that you can look at from what's been done in previous spending bills. So there's a big history here that it's pretty easy to find. But you want to look at how it's been done in the past. Think about what could be done to nudge what you're trying to accomplish forward. Ideally, like I mentioned earlier, something that would resonate or that should resonate with what the agency or department may already be doing or considering. Maybe they just need a little bit of a push forward, or maybe you want to take it to a higher level or build upon something that's been done a while back. Talk to the congressional offices that you're working with most. Chances are they would hopefully be receptive to working with you to put a request in. There's a whole process when it comes to appropriations requests that offices will have to submit to the Appropriations Committee. If you do a sign-on letter, which is a way to get more members engaged or supportive, there's timelines at place here. So there are a lot of nuances that you would want to be mindful of going forward. But first and foremost, I'd say think about the ideas that you may have or your needs. Start talking to some of the offices that you've been working with or that maybe care most about this topic. And then from there, it would probably evolve forward, including maybe getting to a point where you would have some direct conversations with the Appropriations Committee staff to walk them through what you're trying to achieve, giving them the rationale, and helping answer any questions they may have. So There are a lot of steps here. I don't want to make it sound overly simplified, but at the very base level, think about your idea or ideas and start talking to congressional offices about it. And keep in mind, this isn't going to be the same as passing a law that mandates, X, Y, and Z. Appropriations report language can only go so far. It can be very helpful and very impactful, but it's not. I wouldn't suggest that it's a substitute for enacting a full-on legislation either.
That was, I think, a great explanation. Thank you. Perhaps there were some questions about, FY 2021. Could you give just a really quick summary of where that is right now? I mean, very basic.
Well, the December 11th, the big date, right? It's one day after my anniversary, so I'll have to remember that one. It's the day that Congress, right now, under the continuing resolution, that's when we're funded through September 11th. So that means that really two things have to happen. One is by that date, Congress will wrap up spending bills and they'll be able to pass either around that date or a little beforehand a complete package of FY21 spending bills. That's when it would be referred to. Typically, the term here that you may hear is the omnibus appropriations bills. So it means basically they'll throw all of these bills or many bills into one package, get it on the floor, get it through, and everything gets taken care of. Another scenario is that they may have to do another temporary spending bill, another stopgap measure. That could be, I think many of us would hope that it would be short term, that maybe they need a little more time to get everything wrapped up, but they have a agreement in principle. So one scenario could be that they'll pass a short term spending bill that maybe gets them through maybe another week, maybe December 18th or 20th, while they can actually complete work on the larger complete omnibus bill. Now, if no agreement comes about and if it just proves elusive, what I think the least appealing scenario to I think many of us would be that there's a longer term continuing resolution or stopgap bill that essentially punts this into the first quarter, January, maybe even February, for Congress and the new administration to have to come back and address. I don't know of many people who really love that scenario because even when you think about it coming in with a new Congress, a new administration, one of the least appealing things is spending ridiculous amounts of time and energy on figuring out a fiscal year that's already several months in by that point in time. So I think there is the appetite to get this done in one way or another this calendar year. But of course, whether or not we can get to the point where that happens, that's the $64,000 question there. There seem to be some positive indicators, but as we all know, it's very fluid and a lot can erupt at a last minute to table the deal, especially when the other issue here that's related is another round of COVID related relief. Could that be a component of this larger bill? That's another, I guess I would say, complicating factor in the mix.